The first strange thing was the silence. Maple Street almost never slept. Not really. A freight train usually rumbled along the river at dawn. A pair of teenagers skated past the public library before school. And someone's sprinkler hissed across a yellowing lawn even in October. But on that particular morning, the whole town of Cedar Glen felt as if it had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe. Rain had hammered the roofs all night. By sunrise, the storm staggered off toward the interstate, leaving the sidewalks glazed and the oak leaves matted to the curb like wet confetti. Power was out in patches. The bell at St. Gabriel Parish didn't ring. And yet, a soundless bell seemed to call one person out the front door. She was a widow who had taught fourth grade reading for 31 years. A woman who had kept a tidy life by holding fast to tidy routines. She pulled on rubber boots, shrugged into a navy raincoat, and tucked a rosary into her pocket the way some people keep a house key in their shoe. She did not consider herself brave. She considered herself stubborn enough to keep moving. Her name was Ruth Callahan. Ruth lived 3 blocks from St. Gabriel's, a red brick church with a stone statue of the Blessed Virgin on a pedestal at the edge of the parish green. On Saturday evenings, teenagers with guitars led a praise chorus from the parish hall. And on Sunday mornings, the knights flipped pancakes in the gym. It was that kind of place. People knew what to bring to a funeral without being asked. They brought lasagnas, bunk cakes, and silence where silence belonged. Ruth did not plan to stop at the church on her way to Carmine's bakery. But habit is its own gravity. The parish green lay on her route, the shortest path to fresh bread. She cut across the wet grass, boots sinking. As she passed under the low limbs of the sycamore, she saw something that made her swallow air as if she had forgotten to breathe. 2. A puppy stood at the foot of the statue, drenched and shaking, balancing upright on its hind legs. Ruth stopped. The puppy's 2 front paws were pressed together, not quite touching, the way a nervous child clasps hands before asking a favor. Its head tilted up toward the stone face of the Virgin. The eyes were enormous and desperate and embarrassingly human. No one else was on the green. The church doors were locked. The town waited under a blanket of rain-washed quiet. "Sweet Lord," Ruth whispered. Because you cannot see a creature plead like that and say nothing. If the statue had turned its face, if stone had bloomed into living skin and a robe had rustled, perhaps Ruth would have fled. But Mary remained stone. Rain-streaked, her hands extended in the carved invitation every Catholic learns to recognize, "Come." The puppy's plea, on the other hand, was alive. It pivoted at the sound of Ruth's voice, but didn't run. It looked at her the way a child looks at a nurse with a needle, terrified and trusting at once. "You're soaked," Ruth murmured. Kneeling. "Where on earth did you come from?" She tried the universal coaxing sounds. The puppy took a single step toward her, whining low. Small ribs trembled under muddy fur. The left ear drooped. There was an odor of wet leaves and rust. Ruth extended a hand. The puppy pressed its forehead into her palm, then turned and padded away on stiff, awkward legs, pausing every few steps to glance back as if to say, "Are you coming?" "I suppose I am," Ruth said to the empty green. She was 63. She did not chase things anymore. Not buses, not fashion, not answers to questions that would never be answered this side of heaven. But she followed that puppy. It led her off the green, past the quiet parish hall with its bulletin board of spaghetti dinners and baby bottle drives, down a narrow alley behind the thrift store where a hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Closed due to power outage." They crossed Walnut, where floodwaters still hissed into the storm drains. Then cut behind the old train depot, now a coffee shop with Edison bulbs and a shelf of used paperbacks no one returned. Ruth had taught the barista's mother, "The world is small in a town where you teach fourth grade for 31 years. The puppy limped through a tangle of weeds beside the chain-link fence that guarded an abandoned warehouse. The storm had ripped a piece of corrugated metal loose. It flapped in the wind like a wounded bird. Beyond the fence, in the shadow of a loading dock, Ruth saw a shape and felt her chest clench. A dog lay there. A full-grown dog, slick with rain and mud, panting in shallow, rapid bursts. Her coat, beneath mud, might once have been a warm golden brown. Now it was a mosaic of dirt and leaf fragments, and one front leg was twisted at an angle that made Ruth's stomach lurch. The eyes were dull but fixed on the puppy, as if willing him to stand between her and the world. "Oh," Ruth said softly, a single syllable that meant stop time. "Make it not so. Help." "Oh." The puppy squeezed under the fence. It put its face against the mother dog's face and whined. Ruth looked at the fence, the loading dock, the broken land where the town's manufacturing had died, the place where men had once bounced paychecks and boys had learned not to count on steady work. In a better world, there would be no abandoned warehouses. In a better world, there would be no dogs left behind. In this world, there was Ruth and a fence and a dog's soft panting. She slid her fingers under the chain link and lifted. The bottom of the fence bit into her palm, but she shoved the curve upward until there was a wedge of space. Wet grass. Open enough. The puppy scrambled through. The mother did not move except to track Ruth with her eyes. "I'm going to help you," Ruth said, as if a dog could recognize sincerity. She inched forward, boots scudding on gravel, and knelt in the puddles. When she placed her hands under the mother's chest, the dog moaned. Not a bark, not a growl, a sound with the humility of pain. The puppy hopped from one side to the other, frantic. Ruth spoke the only language she had. "Blessed Mother, be with us," she whispered. "Blessed Mother, be near." She did not have children of her own. She had taught generations. She had bandaged playground knees and collected secret notes that whispered of parents fighting, of brothers who drank, of evenings when there was no dinner. She had loved all those kids without needing to keep any of them. And yet the weight of this dog in her arms, this living creature too hurt to run away, unlocked a door in her heart she thought she had locked on purpose when her husband died. She lifted. The broken leg hung, useless. She gathered the dog to her chest and crawled backward under the fence. Scrapes be damned. The puppy wriggled beside them, pushing its nose into the mother's fur. When Ruth stood at last, swaying with the weight, she whispered to the world, "Move. Please. Just get out of the way." A pickup slowed at the end of the alley. The driver peered through a rain-beaded window, then continued down Maple. No one stopped. The world does not always stop when a miracle is taking shape. Sometimes miracles are small, and they sweat. The veterinary clinic sat 2 blocks off Main Street, a low building with a blue sign and a carved wooden cat. The lights were on. The town might be partially dark, but the clinic had a generator humming. Ruth pushed the door open with her hip and called out, "Help! Please!" A receptionist in scrubs stood so fast the chair smacked the counter. From the back, a tall man with gray at his temples appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. "What do we have?" he said, crossing the floor in 3 long strides. "A mother," Ruth said, voice shaking. "A mother who can hardly breathe and a puppy who led me to her." The veterinarian glanced from dog to puppy to Ruth. He took the mother from Ruth's arms with a tenderness that argued he understood more than he said. "I'm Daniel Torres," he said. "You did right bringing them. Let's get her on a table." He called for an assistant. They vanished behind a swinging door. The puppy followed, but was intercepted gently by a vet tech with a jar of treats. Ruth's arms, suddenly empty, twitched with an urge to hold something else. She gripped her rosary inside the pocket of her coat until the crucifix pressed a print into her palm. Minutes passed. Then an hour. It is hard to measure hospital time, even in a vet clinic, because all time becomes a waiting room. The rain thinned to mist. The power flickered and came back. Ruth realized she was breathing with the rhythm of her Hail Marys. The repetition anchored her before it became automatic. Each prayer was a rung on a ladder in a well. At last, Daniel stepped into the lobby and leaned both palms on the counter, the way a man does when he is about to say something that requires gravity but also offers hope. "She's going to live," he said. The breath left Ruth's chest as if a hand had released it. The puppy, who had fallen asleep with its nose against Ruth's boot, thumped its tail once, then twice. "We set the leg," Daniel continued. "She's dehydrated, beat up, and a little malnourished. But she's a fighter. If infection doesn't set in, she'll recover." The puppy is underweight but otherwise healthy. They both need rest, warmth, a safe place. Ruth stood very still. The parish bell did not ring, but she heard something ring inside her. "Do you have a place for them?" she asked. Though she knew the clinic had steel cages and weekend volunteers and a list of people who might foster if asked. "We can board them for a couple of nights, but after that I'll need to place them," Daniel said, choosing his words. "I have a house," Ruth said. The words sounded like a fact and a question that had been waiting for an answer. 3 bedrooms and too much quiet. "I can foster them, if you'll show me what to do." Daniel studied her, as if he could see beneath her raincoat to the years of organized loneliness gathered beneath. "I can show you," he said, "and I can send you home with supplies." The clinic sent her home with antibiotics and bandages, dog food and a borrowed crate. They sent her home with instructions written in a hand as neat as a catechism. They sent her home with 2 living things who expected nothing and needed everything. The mother dog lay in the back seat of Ruth's sedan with eyes half closed and a leg bundled in gauze. The puppy pressed himself against her as if to ensure the world would not separate them now that it had dragged them together. When Ruth pulled into her driveway, the parish bell finally rang noon. It tolled through the pale autumn sky. 3 clean notes of metal on air. And Ruth, who had been carrying grief like a folded quilt in her chest for years, felt something loosen. She had been married to a man named Miles for 37 years. He had loved routine, too. On Sundays he ironed shirts while listening to the baseball game on the radio. He had made chili every first cold afternoon in October. He had died in their kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday. No one is ready for the phone to ring in the middle of a grocery list. No one is ready for a voice to say the words that rearrange your life into before and after. Grief had made Ruth careful. She did not reach for things she might not be able to hold. She kept busy enough to avoid letting the house speak to her in the evenings. She had told herself this was prudence, not fear. But as she opened her front door that afternoon, she understood that prudence and fear sometimes wear the same coat, and both can be taken off. She laid quilts on the living room rug. She slid the crate beside the couch. The puppy explored immediately. Nose down, tail wagging in circles that could have powered the dark end of town. The mother lifted her head, watched her child, and sighed as if the world had finally put her down where she belonged. Ruth stood in the doorway and stared as if she had discovered two strangers asleep in her house and realized they were family. For the first time in a long time, she laughed. Not a loud laugh. Not a laugh meant for other people. A low, private sound that lives between gratitude and surprise. If anyone had been there to hear it, they would have known by that sound that someone who had been sleepwalking had awakened. But no one was there. The only witnesses were a dog whose eyes had dulled with pain and a puppy who believed that the right person had finally followed him home. The first night was difficult. Pain medicine wears off. Puppies cry when the house sighs in the dark. The refrigerator hummed and clicked, and the streetlight outside the bay window made shadows move like shy intruders. Ruth slept on the couch with her hand inside the crate, palm curved against the mother's ribcage so she could feel breath. The puppy slept with his chin across Ruth's wrist. The house, which had felt like a museum of careful grief, discovered how to be a home for the living. By morning, the sun pushed through a rag of cloud and painted a band of light across the hardwood floor. The parish power had returned. The bell rang the Angelus. Ruth boiled water for oatmeal, then poured kibble into a shallow bowl and set out a second dish. The one Daniel had sent for softened food that would go easy on a mother recovering from trauma. The puppy ate with a vigor that made Ruth think of her fourth graders on Pancake Fridays. The mother ate as if each bite were a promise kept. Ruth named them without announcing she had done it. The puppy became Scout, because he had sought help and led it home. The mother became Grace, because Ruth could not bring herself to say miracle out loud but needed a word close to it. The clinic checked in. The parish called to say they were collecting household goods for a family whose basement had flooded. Did she want to help sort? People she had not spoken to in months texted to ask if she had power, if she needed anything, if she would come to bingo to keep score like she always did. Ruth answered some messages and ignored others. She was busy learning. She learned how to change a bandage without getting snapped at. She learned how to hold a pill at the hinge of a jaw. She learned that the sound of a puppy's small snores at 2 a.m. can teach an old house to breathe right. Word got out, as word does in towns where people notice when the light in your front room burns later than usual. Someone posted a photo of the puppy asleep with his paws crossed on the parish green, eyes lifted toward the statue of the Virgin. And the caption said, "Did anyone else see this?" It looked like he was praying. Comments multiplied. Some rolled their eyes at sentimentality. Others quoted saints. One man asked why the church didn't spend more on shelters for humans instead of on statues carved from stone. A woman replied that her brother had slept in the parish hall when the county shelter was full last winter. A high school kid pasted 3 articles about cruelty to animals and asked, "How do we let this happen?" The thread grew noisy. The photo traveled. People came by the parish green to look at the statue as if something else might happen. They stopped Ruth in the grocery store, where she was suddenly buying dog treats alongside milk, and asked how the mother was doing. Some donated to the clinic's benevolence fund, which had covered the surgery Ruth, on a retired teacher's pension, could not have afforded. The Knights announced a hot dog sale with a sign that read, "For Grace and Scout's Friends." Because once people name things, their hearts have already chosen sides. But kindness is not the only thing that multiplies when a story finds air. On the second Thursday after the storm, someone spray-painted across the base of the Marian statue, "Pray for real people, not dogs." The words stunned the town. Even those who agreed with the sentiment argued you do not vandalize a church. Father Augustine preached a homily about Mary standing with anyone wounded, two-legged or four-legged, and about how indignation without charity becomes its own kind of violence. Ruth read the message and felt her throat tighten, not because a stone had been defaced, but because the rage in the letters felt like something that had passed through human hands and wanted to linger. She thought of a child from her last year teaching. A boy named Finn who had bitten another boy during recess because he hadn't learned that pain travels faster through the body than a thought does. She thought of her own anger at the unfairness of living the next decades without Miles. She thought of the clean look of a blank vase under a statue and how easily it invites chalk and flowers and candles, as well as the occasional bottle thrown from a passing car. Two teenagers from youth group showed up with scrub brushes and soapy water. They cleaned the paint off the pedestal, working in silence. A woman in a suit stopped, set her briefcase down, and helped. A man in a wheelchair came by and told a story about his son. The day a dog had licked the boy's hand so gently the boy had quit flinching at every touch. Another man, old enough to have learned the catechism by numbers, said, "We ought to talk about why people lash out in the first place." He wasn't defending the vandal. He was expanding the picture. There is a difference between giving cover and giving context. If a town forgets that difference, it forgets how to be a town. Ruth did not wade into the comment thread raging beneath the photo. Instead, she put a note on the parish bulletin board: "Vet bills paid in full thanks to you. We are fostering. If you want to support the clinic's benevolence fund, here is how. If you are angry about something in your life and need to say it out loud, I will meet you for coffee at the depot." Her phone number was at the bottom. She thought no one would call. 3 people called. 2 wanted to yell about politics. 1 wanted to talk about his mother's dementia. How unfair it was. How angry he felt. And how he had been ashamed of the anger until a stranger's note made him think anger might be grief in a leather jacket. Grace's leg healed. She went from stumbling to walking with a limp to trotting on 4 even steps. Tail high. Scout turned his paws into planks. He chewed table legs with a dedication that impressed Ruth even as she scolded him. They learned where the yard ended and where the neighbor's flower bed began. They learned the rhythm of a day, mass at 8 on weekdays, a walk past the firehouse at 10, a nap at 2 so devoted you would think they had invented rest. Ruth learned to introduce herself again. The grief that had made her careful did not vanish. It found a place to sit that was not the front seat. Some afternoons, when the late sun slanted across the living room and lit the mash of dog toys on the rug like an offering of color, she would say Miles's name and thank him for helping her build a life sturdy enough to shelter 2 unplanned guests. She did not talk aloud to the statue on the green. She did not need to. It had already done its work. Statues remind you to look up. The rest is cooperation. Cooperation became a daily practice. At the clinic, Daniel's assistant taught Ruth how to massage scar tissue along Grace's leg to keep it from tightening. At the parish, The director of the food pantry showed Ruth where to stock diapers and which families asked sheepishly for pet food along with spaghetti and sauce. At home, Ruth learned that you can measure healing by the distance between a creature and sleep. At first, Scout had only slept when touching either Grace or Ruth. Now he'd fall asleep in a patch of sunlight with his paws twitching in a dream. And Ruth would feel something like peace pass through the house as quiet as a mouse under a baseboard. On a cold evening in December, with Advent wreaths in living room windows and a choir practicing O Come, O Come, Emmanuel across town, Ruth took Grace and Scout back to the parish green after dark. A dusting of snow made the grass look like a white quilt. Someone had strung soft lights through the sycamore. The statue's face looked gentle in the glow, as if it had acquired the patience of the season by standing there long enough to hear the town's whole inventory of hopes and regrets. Ruth stood at the foot of the pedestal with a leash in each hand and did something she never would have done 6 months earlier. She told her story there, out loud, under her breath in case any passerby might think she was odd. She told Mary she had spent years hoarding quiet like a resource because she feared the world would take from her everything it had left her. She told Mary about the phone call that had split her life and the way she had taped it back together with busyness and politeness and dignity. She confessed she had believed she was managing until a puppy stood like a boy at First Communion beneath a statue and asked for something she could not say no to without breaking what was still breakable inside herself. "Thank you," she said. And the words belonged to the town as much as to heaven. A step sounded on the sidewalk. Ruth turned, startled. A young woman stood there holding a folded lawn sign. On one side it read, "Love your neighbor." On the other, "It's not charity to keep what you never needed in the first place." Ruth braced. Opinions were a sport in December, and this woman looked like she played varsity. "Are you the lady with the dogs?" the woman asked, hunching her shoulders into her scarf. "I am," Ruth said carefully. "I'm Kay," the woman said. "I work nights at the hospital. I was one of the nurses when your husband came in. I remember you. You held his hand and prayed out loud. The night the power went out. My brother sent me that photo of the puppy here. I wanted to be mad at people for caring about an animal when I had a patient coding down the hall. But then I read about what you did. I've been angry all year. And I think maybe I turned it into a habit. I can't figure out how to stop without feeling like I'm giving up on justice." Ruth held both leashes in her left hand and put her right hand into her pocket, where the rosary lived. "Sometimes," she said, "justice is a flame that lights the room. Sometimes anger is that same flame without a lantern around it. One burns steady. One burns down the curtains. Which is this?" Kay nodded toward the statue. "Lantern," Ruth said. "At least it was for me. What do you need it to be for you?" Kay swallowed and blinked fast. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe a place to put my hands while I decide." "Do you want to meet them?" Ruth asked. And Grace stepped forward as if she had been listening the whole time. Kay knelt in the snow and let Scout lick her chin. She laughed, then steadied herself with a hand on Grace's back. For a moment, the three of them formed a little chapel right there on the green. Not a perfect chapel, not a cathedral. A place with breathing and shared weight and warmth. If someone had been passing and looked up at the lighted statue, they might have felt that strange pull to step off the sidewalk and join the small congregation of women and dogs and winter. And perhaps they would have been right to obey it. On Christmas Eve, Ruth took a pew at the midnight mass for the first time since Miles's funeral. The church was full. Coats steamed. A baby fuss then quieted, as if lulled by the hush that falls on a sanctuary when the opening line of a beloved hymn rises. The priest preached about how God had chosen to come not with force, but with vulnerability. Not to smash injustice in a single blow, but to seat the world with people who choose the difficult mercy of staying. He spoke of Mary as the first to learn that love can pierce you and still be worth saying yes to. Ruth did not cry. She did not need to. She stood when the congregation stood and sang when they sang, and thought of a town that had argued and scrubbed spray paint and raised money and baked too many cookies and shown up to see whether an old story still fit their new needs. She thought of one nurse who had set down a sign for a moment to pet a dog and, in that small pause, had remembered how to place her hands. She thought of a woman who had followed a puppy and, in the following, had recovered the courage to contradict her own sorrow. When Mass ended, choir voices followed the people out into the cold. The parking lot sparkled with salt. Ruth walked home with Grace and Scout trotting close, their breath making soft clouds. At her front door, she paused and looked up at the winter sky. Stars insisted on themselves through the leftover gauze of cloud. Her breath made its own brief stars. She laughed again. That private laugh that lives between gratitude and surprise. Inside, she set down bowls, kicked off boots, and hung her coat. She stood in the quiet and listened. The house sounded like a home. Not because it was full of noise, but because the silence inside it felt like a choice instead of a punishment. Grace settled on the rug with a sigh. Scout dragged a blanket to the couch and collapsed with so much relief you would think he had invented sleep again. "Thank you," Ruth said into the room. She set her rosary on the coffee table without thinking. The way you put down your keys after a long trip and know you'll pick them up in the morning to go where you belong. In January, a reporter came by to ask whether Ruth believed the puppy had actually prayed. Ruth smiled and told the truth. "I think he asked for help in the only way he knew how," she said. "We call it prayer when we do it. When a creature without words does the same. I don't know what else to call it." The reporter asked what she would say to people who had scolded the town for caring more about dogs than people. Ruth said she didn't think compassion worked like a pie you had to slice thinner if you fed more. She said that people had written checks to the clinic and the food pantry the same day. She said sometimes a small mercy teaches your hands the shape of a larger mercy. The point isn't to argue about whose pain deserves a bandage, she said. The point is to become the kind of town where your hands are already reaching. The article ran. Most readers nodded. A few wrote furious comments anyway. The world did what the world does. It made an argument and a casserole. By spring, Grace ran. Not fast. Not far. But she ran. Scout developed a habit of waiting at the window near 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Ears pricked. Because he had learned the sound of school buses and the smell of children in the first warm months of the year. Ruth took them to the Parish green again on a day with wind high enough to flip hair into eyes. The base of the statue bore no new spray paint. Instead, it held a cluster of candles burned down to glass circles and a note in a child's uneven print. "Thank you for helping my dad's friend." Another note, more careful. "Read, pray for my brother. He is lost." The words were not meant for dogs. They were meant for mercy itself. That evening, Ruth sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter to her past self. She did not plan to mail it anywhere. She wrote, "Dear friend who is afraid of needing anything." And then she told the truth. She wrote about how choosing to love again after loss is not a betrayal of what you lost. She wrote about how the town had held out its hands and argued, and then held out its hands again. She wrote about how a statue had not moved, but a heart had. In May, the town's festival returned to Main Street with funnel cakes and a parade of children on tricycles and a contest for best pie. The knights entered 2 pies and 1 dog. Grace, wearing a bandana someone had embroidered with the word found, sat beside the booth where Ruth sold raffle tickets to raise money for the clinic's fund. People came by and scratched her head and told stories about their own rescues. The kind where you save something and discover it has saved you right back. Scout took 2nd place in a contest for waggiest tail. A teenager accepted his prize ribbon and looked around as if embarrassed to be having a good time in public. Then he smiled so fast it looked like a mistake and tucked the ribbon into his pocket. That night, as fireworks strobed over the river, Ruth stood with her neighbors and tilted her face toward the loud sky. A little kid near her pressed sticky fingers into her palm and said, "Is she scared?" His other hand held a sparkler. He was pointing at Grace, who was not trembling but had set her ears back the way dogs do when sound arrives without warning. "She's okay," Ruth said, squeezing the little hand. "We stay together when it's loud." The boy nodded as if the line contained a rule he could use. Stay together when it's loud. Rules like that build towns. They build families. They build churches and kitchens and hospital rooms and classrooms where a teacher can lift a child's chin and tell him he is not the worst thing he has done. Summer burned itself into August, then relaxed into September and the smell of baked apples. On the anniversary of the storm, a group gathered at the parish green as the bell rang the Angelus. Father Augustine said a simple prayer. A woman who always cried at funerals cried. A man who rarely spoke in public said he was proud to share a town with people who looked after their own and after what others left behind. He said he had come to lay flowers for a friend who had worked at the warehouse that was now an empty shell, and for a dog who had taught him a word he hadn't used in years without wincing: hope. Ruth did not speak at the gathering, but she listened the way you listen to a choir when your voice isn't strong enough to carry a line on its own. Afterward, she walked home with Grace and Scout, who had learned the route so well they knew when to tug left at the corner without being told. She put a pot of water on the stove. Not because she needed tea, but because water on the stove is a way to say, "I live here." The house breathed like a creature at rest. She understood, finally and clearly, that her life had not been ruined by sorrow. It had been reconfigured by love. What happened next was ordinary and not. Grace grew old the way creatures blessed with a reprieve grow old, with a dignity that made people generous. Scout stayed, because of course he did. Ruth joined the parish committee no one wanted to join, the one in charge of peeling wax out of carpet and ordering toilet paper in bulk. She realized she minded less than she thought she would. She started a small fund in Miles's name at the clinic, and when the bank teller asked what to call the line on the account, she said, "The lantern." The teller nodded. Not because she understood the reference, but because she trusted that Ruth did. Years later, when a second storm came and the river rose higher than anyone believed it could, the parish hall held cots for families who'd lost bedrooms and refrigerators and the casual comfort of knowing the dry place in the house belonged to them. The clinic ran a pop-up to check injured animals. The kids who had once scrubbed paint off the statue came back from college and brought friends to move sandbags. The older man in the wheelchair collected names for a list titled "People We Still Need to Find." A nurse with a sign that now read "Love is a verb" kissed a toddler's cheek and checked on an elderly neighbor 2 blocks over. Ruth opened her door to a woman with a laundry basket and said, "Put that right there." Then handed her a towel and said, "This is yours for as long as you need it." Grace was gone by then, as all good things eventually are, and Scout slept more than he ran. But the house still knew how to breathe right. Because once you learn, you do not forget. The statue did not move that week either. The hands stayed open. People put their own hands in them without touching stone. A town is not a miracle in the sense that it breaks the laws of nature. It is a miracle in the sense that it keeps choosing one another in spite of the laws of selfishness and exhaustion and fear. It keeps showing up at prayer services and bake sales. It keeps cleaning spray paint before the sun dries it. It keeps arguing and then carrying someone else's box anyway. Sometimes, when the wind ached from the north and the sycamores cracked in the cold and Maple Street slept at last, Ruth would pass the green on her way home from a late meeting. She would pause and look up at the statue. And sometimes she would see a person standing there who did not want to be seen. Someone whose shoulders hunched with the weight of a thing still being carried. She would watch, without staring, as the person lifted their eyes to the carved face. Sometimes the person would speak. Sometimes the mouth would not move at all. Either way, there was a language passing back and forth that did not require explanation. Ruth would walk on, thankful to live in a place where that language was still spoken in public. People asked, over the years, whether the story was true. Was there really a puppy who stood like a boy at First Communion and drew a widow out of her house and a mother out of a ruin and a town out of itself? The answer depended on what you needed the story to accomplish. If you needed it to vindicate a theology or win a debate, the answer was probably no. If you needed it to nudge you toward the door of your own house on a morning when the air held its breath, the answer was yes enough. On the 10th anniversary of the storm, the parish hosted a simple supper in the hall. They served chili. Miles would have been pleased and a pan of cornbread that evaporated in 10 minutes. A high schooler read a poem about rescue that made even the men who claim not to like poetry blink. The clinic hung a poster of faces, human and otherwise, whose lives had intersected with its benevolence fund. A line at the bottom of the poster read, "The Lantern Fund thanks you." Someone asked what the name meant. Daniel, older now and still tall, pointed at Ruth. She shook her head and said nothing, because some things do not improve by being explained. When the evening ended, people stacked chairs with the competence of those who have been stacking chairs since before they were old enough to lift them without wobbling. Ruth walked outside with a styrofoam container of leftovers and found Kay waiting near the statue, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I still get angry," Kay said, almost apologetically. "So do I," Ruth said cheerfully. "It's a sign I care. How do you keep it from being the flame without the lantern?" Ruth glanced up at the statue and answered the way you do when you have learned what you are going to say by living it first. "I put it where it belongs. In prayer. In service. In my own hands. Doing the small work that keeps a thing alive. If the flame won't fit in those places, I let it go out and start again with a spark that will." They stood in silence that was not empty. Snow began to fall. The kind of snow that edits the sharpness off the world and gives you back a draft you can live with. Kay slipped her arm through Ruth's. Unembarrassed. "Do you think?" Kay asked. "That dog knew what he was doing that day?" "I think he knew more than enough," Ruth said. And that is how it ended. Which is to say that it did not end at all, but settled into the ordinary holiness of people and creatures learning one another's weight, sharing it, and calling the sharing by names older than the town itself: mercy, justice, love. If you walk across the parish green in the early morning, you may still feel the silence that feels like an invitation. If you follow it, you may find yourself standing at the foot of a statue you have passed 100 times without seeing. If you look up, you may discover that what you have been carrying has been waiting for you to place it somewhere steady. If you listen, really listen, you might hear the bell ring from somewhere inside your chest. When it does, do what Ruth did. Say yes. Now. I would like to hear from you. Stories like this often divide us. Some say compassion for animals distracts from human suffering. Others argue mercy grows by practice and never subtracts. Where do you stand on violence and injustice in our communities, the cruelty we inflict on the vulnerable? Whether human or not, do small acts of care challenge injustice? Or do they risk becoming a substitute for deeper change? Share your view in the comments. And say it plainly. Your perspective matters here.